We are out here in beautiful, crisp, rather chilly air, and autumn has begun. I'm in central Colorado around Crested Butte right now, and the fall colors have just begun, as you can see behind me. So we're going to be spending the next few weeks working our craft, trying to capture the magic of autumn while it lasts. We already had a snowstorm with hail, thunder, and lightning, and it took some of the early leaves down. So we're hoping that that will not happen again for a while, because things are just beginning to happen. I'd like to share some tips with you about photographing fall color, no matter where you are in the world, to give you some creative ideas as we celebrate this season. First and foremost, just get out there and start photographing. The mountains and the forest are calling, and it won't last long. Some of the photos you'll make are what I call calendar or postcard images, and there's nothing wrong with that. Images like this are just pretty, yet I encourage you to dive deeper, get closer, and find your own unique ways to express the beauty of autumn. As you do, you begin to see more creatively. Let's talk first about light, because that's a really important part of photography, and in fall it's essential for capturing some of those special moments. Pay attention to it so that you can use it creatively. Remember that diffused light is often the best way to capture the details in nature, even in a large landscape. You see so much more into the forest, you can almost count the leaves on the trees, because the lowered contrast allows you to see so much. Even the textures often show up better in soft light. Don't wait for sunny days. In fact, sunny days for scenes like this can be too much contrast. Just get out there and use the light you have. If you're out on a cloudy day, find the images that work best under cloudy or diffused light. After watching this video, you will have some ideas of the kinds of photos that work in different light. This image has a softness, it was a frosty morning, and it's just overall pleasing and gentle. And yet after the sun came up in a very nearby area, this was the image that I could create. It has more drama, a little bit more energy, and yet it still works. The contrast actually helps bring out some of the texture, and the backlighting creates a glow on some of the plants and trees. And speaking of backlight creates drama. When you can separate it from the background, sometimes where the background is completely dark, that's really exciting. In this case, I liked the way the backlighting also etched the edges of the fir trees. It creates this wonderful glow through the leaves in the forest, and be aware that whatever the color of those leaves are will be the overall color cast that happens in your picture. So in these greeny yellow aspen leaves, I've got this greenish yellow glow going on. And you don't always want to correct that. Sometimes that's the thing that expresses what you were experiencing the best. And when you're in a forest that has oranges and reds and yellows and greens mixed, well, you just have to look at the color that you get. And I photograph in daylight balance so that what I see is what I get, and then I can make adjustments afterwards if I feel like I need to. But look for that glow. In this case, backlighting was really nice, and yet the shadows were pretty deep, so I used a high dynamic range technique of bracketing my exposures and then processing that later in the computer to bring out the result that I wanted. If you're underneath the tree, the canopy of leaves and the light shining through that from sun overhead is in effect backlight, and it creates this wonderful glow. And on the forest floor, low angles of light can give you, in this case, both side light and backlight, just to create something different about autumn. The leaves that fall on the ground are just as important in the small scenes, are great to capture. Look at side light for texture. The bigger scene, often when the light is low, and especially if it's not too much contrast, will rake across your landscape and rake across the tops of the trees as it did here and create this wonderful texture. This happened here too. A storm was coming, the sun broke through the clouds in late afternoon, and it just raked across the tops of the trees. Now, I spoke about high dynamic range earlier. This kind of a scene is very hard to capture in one image because the contrast was just really strong. Now, these days, with a lot of our cameras, we have a latitude that's quite wide, and you might be able to process the image both for the shadows and the highlights, either two processes and blending them together, or even a single process. But high dynamic range, which is the technique of bracketing your exposures so you have some over, some on, and some under, will allow you to then use software like Lightroom's HDR or Photoshop or other third-party software to combine those images and create a lowered contrast that allows you to still capture the mood and the feeling of walking through this dappled light. Think about creating sunbursts using a small aperture, typically f11, f16, on a wider angle. You're not going to get that if you're photographing at 200 millimeters or maybe even 70 millimeters, but anything from 16 up to about 35 millimeters typically will give you a nice sunburst. And remember that early and late light enhances the warm colors. So your yellows, your reds, your oranges are even richer when you're working in those warmer color temperatures of early in the morning and late afternoon light. Don't forget about cloudy weather, though. Cloudy weather is some of my favorite weather to go out and photograph at all seasons. And in particular, when you've got a lot of clouds in the larger landscape, you can create drama. It's not always about this beautiful bluebird sky and sunny day, right? Well, these pictures here represent cloudy days, stormy days, times when it's right on the edge of maybe becoming too stormy, but the light is still breaking through the clouds, and it creates drama and visual interest in your bigger scene. And if the storms do come and you're able to stay out in the storm, you get moody images like this. I liked how the peak was just exposed a little bit through a break in these low clouds on the slope. And the low clouds here in Slovenia's Julian Alps added a great mood to the scene because they just slowly moved around, rose up from the valley floor, revealed the peaks, then covered them up again. And because we were out prepared in rain gear and rain gear for our camera, we were photographing during this whole thing when it wasn't pouring, and we were able to capture a lot of magic because of being out there during the storm. And then when the storm clears, you're already out there and you have an opportunity perhaps to get an image like this that is fall changing to winter rather abruptly. Don't forget to use your polarizer. This scene is polarized and it cuts through the sheen on the leaves, it saturates their colors, it cuts through the sheen on the wet rocks as well, on any wet surface. So use that polarizer, and that's the difference if you don't polarize. You can create visual depth in an image, which adds interest and engages your viewer more. So again, this is not a tip just for fall color, but it's a great one to remember when you're out there photographing autumn. And so using these trees in the foreground and then having a middle ground that was also interesting, and then the cloud-covered mountain peaks adds a nice visual depth to the landscape. This has a stepping stone effect, but the spotlight hitting the rabbit brush in the foreground and then just touching on the rabbit brush in the middle ground moves you back from foreground to those background mountains very nicely. And it's really a great way to engage your viewer and invite them into your frame. This has visual depth as well. It's more subtle here, but there's foreground ferns, there's foreground tree trunks, and then there's more behind it, and so forth, back to infinity and the sky. Intimate scenes can have depth. Wide-angle scenes can have depth. Large landscapes can have depth. You just have to think about that foreground-background relationship. So here, using a wide-angle lens and getting low and close, I was able to emphasize the foreground and yet still have information in the scene that is interesting, so you're drawn across the mossy boulders and leaves to the trees beyond. Let's discuss intimate landscapes. They're one of my favorite things to do. The large landscape is beautiful, and sometimes those mountain scenes with fall color, like I showed at the very beginning of this video, are great. But you have to have the right conditions to make them really dramatic. And I just personally like to get closer to nature. I like to have a deeper connection, and intimate landscapes allow me to do that. They typically don't have sky in them. And so in this picture, you might step out from the forest onto this beach and say, oh, well, this is nice. This is kind of pretty. I like the reflection in the wet sand and so forth. But by getting closer, by asking myself what else I could do with that, I was able to make this image, which I personally like a whole lot better. So think about smaller scenes and creating a personal engagement, and therefore your viewer will be personally engaged as well. Remember that you can say the most with the least by simplifying your compositions. And these are just examples of that, simplifying and making a single subject or a subject on top of a textural background like this one. And look for patterns. When you get in closer to things, you start to notice that there are patterns, and they can be really great for fall color as well. Fallen leaves on the ground. If you didn't get it right in your timing and the leaves are mostly off the trees, or you've had a storm come through and it's knocked them all down, you're not done yet. There's beauty on the forest floor, and you just have to go out there and you have to find it. And frost can come and cover everything with a nice coating and etch the edges of some of the small plants that are on the ground. And when you're thinking about patterns, think about breaking up that pattern if you can. As I was walking on this beach along the shore of Lake Superior, it had rained the night before, and so the rocks were all wet, and the wind had blown, and it had blown a couple of leaves here and there onto these rocks. They're really pebbles. And I loved the color in this one aspen leaf and how it was changing. In the story, in the leaf itself, was from green to brown, and there were droplets of water on it from the night's rain. And so that breaks up the pattern of the pebbles that it's sitting on and makes it a visually stronger image. Here, the pine cone does that. It's, again, a whole bunch of big-tooth maple leaves on the ground in the Red Rock area of Utah. And the pattern of the leaves was beautiful, but after a while, my eye was tiring of the pattern. And so the pine cone provides a point of visual rest where you can kind of take stock of everything and then go back and look through the pattern again. And think about texture. Again, when you get in close, you start to see things more deeply, and you notice the textures of lichens and mosses that are on the forest floor. And frost can help bring out that texture in a pile of dried leaves. This is also texture. It's not a close-up scene. It's more of an intimate landscape pulled back, but there is still texture to be had here, and it's an implied texture that comes from all the structure of the lines in the foreground, the lines in the background, the branches, the pattern of the yellow leaves. It's a complex picture but it still works, and it's one of my favorites. Remember, when you're out there, to go wide and create panoramas, especially if you've got opportunities where you've got big vistas and lookout points where you can capture some of the bigger scene. And this is a great way to capture the landscape in autumn. Now, this was stormy light along the Brockway Summit up on the Keweenaw Peninsula, and it was a great day, and it was the perfect day to do a wide view. And I just overlapped 30 to 50%, moving my camera with a vertical composition, moving it from left to right or right to left, and then I put those together using Lightroom's panorama tool. And remember to be on a tripod if the light is low, and do a practice run or two. From left to right, make sure that you're staying level with the horizon, otherwise you may end up cropping something that is critical to the composition. They're really not hard to do, and they can be a lot of fun. You can make these with your phone as well, and that can also really be a fun way to be able to handhold and get a nice panoramic image. A compositional tip, and again, not just for fall color, but we're talking about autumn here, so we put it in. Leading the eye through the frame. From top to bottom, your eye follows the flow of this tiny waterfall, and it follows it past autumn leaves that have landed on all of the boulders around it. And so that is a way to direct the viewer through the scene. This channel in the red rock where all the leaves and pine cones and things were blown into it created a lovely, sensual channel for the eye to move through between the two rocks. And this one, you start at the upper part of the frame and you just step down into the plunge pool below. So it's just a way of creating a pathway for your viewer to move through the scene the way you want. Now, country roads are great during autumn because you've got wonderful colors and the pattern and texture that's all there. And this road was really super because it was not only undulating gently up and down, but it was also curving. And that just made this whole feeling of meandering on an autumn day through the beauty of it. This is an implied pathway, but the yellow cottonwoods in this canyon are growing along the wash in the area where they get the most water, and it just creates this beautiful pathway all the way down through the canyon to the back left. This is a subtle path, but nonetheless there is a pathway to draw you in across the leaves and into the trees. You can also draw attention and engage the viewer in a different way by using contrast. Clearly, these yellow aspens are the subject of this scene, even though everything around them is also really beautiful. Here, this one tall fir tree becomes the subject, surrounded by a beautiful forest. But again, it's sort of like that pattern idea, where you've got something for the eye to rest on. The scene without that tree is lovely, but that gives it visual contrast and it gives the eye a place to rest. Think about reflections. At any time of year, I love working with reflections. And sometimes in the quiet ponds and the rivers that the water levels are lower now. So instead of being full of rapids, they are just slowly meandering, and they create a wonderful mirror for some of those beautiful autumn colors. And if you prefer the straightforward scene of a reflection and the symmetry of it, there's nothing wrong with that. This is a beautiful landscape that I just recently witnessed, and the reflection and the real scene just felt right to have it be more of a symmetrical composition. But you can take reflections a step further. You can play with just the reflection and let the wind that ripples the surface capture a more impressionistic result, sometimes really creating these wavy, squiggly lines and all that great color. It becomes an abstract canvas in that sense, and it's an interpretation of autumn. Then there's also reflecting color. On the streams and rivers that are flowing, if you slow your shutter down, you can blend those reflections and those colors into a beautiful scene like this. Again, interpreting autumn in your own way. Remember that a faster shutter speed will capture a higher gloss on the surface of moving water, whereas a slower shutter speed captures the brushstroke, the paintbrush effect. There's no right answer to this. You have to play, experiment, so that you can get the effect you want. And every river or stream is going to give you something different at the same shutter speed because of the velocity of the water. And every different shutter speed you use will create a different effect. And they're all one of a kind. So just make a lot of pictures like this so that you can pick your favorites out of what you end up with. And with moving water creating a little bit more of an abstract interpretation, I want to talk about another way to interpret autumn. And again, this is not just an autumn tip, but it fits here beautifully. With intentional camera movement or intentional camera motion, ICM, you are moving the camera while you're photographing and creating wonderful abstracts. They require a slow shutter speed and moving the camera while you're exposing so that you paint the colors and you blend the colors. How much you blend depends on how quickly you're moving the camera or how slow or fast your shutter speed is. And again, every one of these is a one of a kind. I love doing these. And you can't create an identical one even if you tried. So experiment with this. Use different focal lengths. Remember that if you're using a wide-angle lens, when you try intentional camera movement, you better have a much slower shutter speed because 1/10 of a second on a 24mm lens will not show nearly the movement that 1/10 of a second on a 70 or 200mm lens would show. Shutter speeds of around 4 seconds to 1/10 of a second are typically the range that I work in. And then there's multiple exposures, another way to interpret autumn in your own unique way. Multiple exposures are sometimes possible in camera if your camera model and make does it. I have to create the images and then combine them in the computer later. But basically, you're just taking exposures and moving the camera ever so slightly, in this case, in a vertical direction, just a little bit, to create a more staccato, stippled effect. You can also pick a point in your scene as a reference and move your camera randomly just a little bit around that point and do 8 or 10 or 16 exposures and then combine those in the computer or using your camera if it has that ability. And it creates this wonderful impressionistic effect. The possibilities are really endless and unique. There's always more than one right answer, in my opinion, whether you want the straightforward image or you want to create a little magical mystery glow to the image. It's all up to you and what you want to do with what you're seeing this autumn. It may be a quiet story that you're trying to tell. Or it might be the story of a sudden change of seasons and the surprise of a snowfall when it's still autumn. Think about ways you can tell the story of autumn that go beyond what you normally create. Push yourself to make photos from the heart Really get out there and connect with nature. And in that process, you will see in a different and new way. What matters most is to get out there and play. And I hope these ideas that I've just presented here will help you. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more videos like this. If you liked this video, please click the bell and subscribe to be the first to know when I publish a new one here. Happy autumn, and happy photographing.